Imagine that color grading exists on a continuum, with the left side of the spectrum being the unaltered image, and the right side being the most stylized Hollywood film you can possibly think of. Now, I like big budget movies as much as the next guy, but if I tried to emulate some of those looks in my documentary and YouTube work, it would probably come off a little bit heavy-handed. On the flip side, the unaltered image is completely devoid of character, and it doesn't actually look as natural as you might think it would. So I think the happy medium for most of us is going to be somewhere in the middle. For me, that's an image that still feels natural, but has a bit of character to it. I want it to still feel like real life, but to have a nice filmic cinematic quality to it. So that's the general philosophy I use to approach how I want to color grade my footage. And in this video, I'm going to be walking you through exactly how I do that, leaving no stone unturned and holding no secrets barred. All right, so the footage we're going to be working with today are some shots from my last video where I drove from Death Valley to Oregon and shot some film along the way. All of these shots were captured on the Sony a7S III in S-Log3 S-Gamut 3 Cine. And the first thing that I want to do is I just want to drop a whole bunch of serial nodes here. So the way I do that is I hold Option, and I press S, and we do that 6 more times. Now that's just the basic amount of nodes that I normally use. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to be creating a template that we can then paste onto all of our other shots and tweak from there. And this helps keep everything nice and tidy. It makes it easier when you're going through it to understand where all the nodes are. And then it also means that you have a kind of a consistent look throughout. So the way I normally structure these things is my first node is for noise reduction, if necessary. Sometimes it just remains untouched. The second one is for Cine Match. We'll get to that in a minute. The third is for my primary corrections. Then we have a transform, which is where we're going to be converting this to Rec 709. We have a creative node, which is where we will add a creative LUT. We have our secondary corrections. And then I just leave one here for masking, just in case I end up using it. Sometimes I don't. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to go over to my transform node, and we're going to add a transform LUT. Now normally this is where you would just drop a color space transform on here, and then you would go to the effects. You would say I'm using Sony S-Log S-Gamut 3 Cine, S-Log3, and then for my output color space, I'm using Rec 709, Rec 709A. Now, that's all you really need to do here. What I do now is I have actually made a custom LUT where it has the Rec 709 conversion in it already, but it also has a few other tweaks that I almost always make. And so instead, I'm just going to go and load my Kodacolor LUT S-Log3 to Rec 709. So the naming of the LUT might be a little bit self-indulgent, but I just thought it was fun. So the Kodacolor is the only LUT that I use, and it's basically just a reliable way to take your footage from S-Log to more cinematic without taking it too far. I do also have a Rec 709 version that I apply for clips that are not Sony. So I make sure, like if someone gives me Canon footage, then I'll convert that to Rec 709 and then I'll apply the LUT, if that makes sense. And so yeah, that's available down below if you want to check it out. This has already gotten us pretty close to where we want to be. The next thing that I want to do is I want to come over to Cine Match. Now this is where we will go down to a plugin called Cine Match. And this is by no means required, but it is just a little bit of extra flavor that takes your footage maybe 5% better, I mean. And basically what this allows you to do is it allows you to choose a camera source profile and a camera target profile. This is normally used when you're trying to match cameras, hence the name Cine Match. Let's say your friend is shooting on Panasonic and you're shooting on Canon and you want to drop all the footage into one timeline and have it look seamless. This is an instance where you would use Cine Match. It will match the color profiles and so that it looks nice and fluid. No jarring transitions of colors and exposure, and if you did your job right. So I'm going to use it for something actually a little bit more sneaky. I'm going to plug in my camera, my Sony a7S III, S-Log3 S-Gamut 3 Cine. And then for target profile, I'm actually going to just drop in a fancier cinema camera, like the Arri Alexa Mini in Log C. Now you'll see it didn't do too much to the footage, but it did make it a little bit softer. There's a little bit more of like a color separation between the hues on the tops of the mountains at sunrise and then the blues. It's very, very subtle difference, but I do find that consistently it makes the imagery look a little bit better. So that's something that I use sometimes, not all the time. Now the next thing that we're gonna do here is we're gonna drop into our primaries. Now most of the time I do all of the grading in the primaries. If necessary, I will jump over to the secondaries and then do some masking as well, but we're just gonna drop into the primaries for now. I got a look at my scopes here, and I can see that the brightest part of the image is this part just right above the mountains, right? And so this is early in the morning. I wanna be very aware of how bright my sky is because it's early morning. If it were midday, we could just hike this up and get our levels really, really bright, but that's not what we wanna do. What I like to do is just establish a nice base S-curve first. Now for those of you who aren't familiar with the curves adjustment, basically this point at the bottom left here represents all of the blacks in the image. If you move this, the blacks will go up, the blacks will go down. Same thing on the other side, but whites. So this represents the brightest part of the image. And all of the information here in the middle, you see these waveforms represent where the data is actually represented on the luminosity scale. So you can see that pretty much everything in this is midtones. And you can see that represented in the scopes here as well. There's nothing that's pure black, there's nothing that's pure white, which is good because this is a very soft lit scene at sunrise before the sun has actually hit the landscape. It's just touching the tops of the mountains. So we want to preserve this nice soft look. So the first thing that I'm going to do is let's just see how it looks if I bring the white point down just around that 768 bar mark. And so we've got this nice soft look. Everything else almost looks a little bit too dark, but I like where the sky is sitting. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to bring up the highlights. And we'll go maybe right about there. And you can see that that's brought our scopes back up a little bit, so we can go ahead and bring these back down. And the first thing that I'm looking for here is I'm looking for a nice contrast between the brightest brights and the highlights. There's no real exact science that I use for this. I pretty much just play with these until I find something that feels like nice and smooth and natural, but also has definition between the two. Something that I see really, really often is, people will they'll smush everything together too much and it looks too flat, if that makes sense. So what we're gonna do here is we're just going to try and find the nice smooth S-curve for everything that makes it look its most vibrant, but also natural. So we've got the highlights somewhere that I like them now. So let's go a little bit further down into our curves and let's take a look at where our shadows are. So the darkest part is my pants right here, is me, really. And you can see that represented here on the scopes. How dark do I want my pants to be? So I think that, one, they're too bright now. So let's just go ahead and grab this point here. Now you can see this is the darkest stuff, really. There's maybe a little bit of something over here, but we can't see it. So I'm just gonna go ahead and bring our pants down, right? Now, right now I'm looking at the overall exposure. I'm not getting too granular on how I look in the shot. I'm just focusing on how the contrast of the whole scene is playing out. And so you can see with just that minor correction, we're looking much more vibrant, but we've still retained the smooth, natural nature of the light. So that looks pretty good, but you'll see that if we toggle between this, I am almost a little bit too dark now. I'm darker than everything else. And that's because I'm facing away from the light source, which is the bright sky behind me. I'm pretty happy with how the image looks overall so far. If we wanted to get a little bit fancier, we could go in here and play with our blues just a little bit. I think the blues in here look pretty good, but something that I'll often do is I will take the color warper and I'll just take the saturation of our blues and shift it a little bit more towards teal. Although in this image, I actually think that the blues shifted ever so slightly towards the purple help accentuate the early sunrise colors on the mountains. So that's what I'm gonna do instead. Now, if we jump over to our mask, this is where we're gonna give myself in the image just a little bit more separation. So we're gonna hop over to this feature called the Magic Mask. And if you're not familiar with the Magic Mask before, it's basically sorcery. So we're gonna take this eyedropper here and we're just gonna draw over me, right? And it doesn't look like it's done anything, and that's because we need to toggle on our highlight. So that's this button here. If you click it, it will show what has been highlighted in the frame by our selection. Now, that looks pretty good. It's selected just me and not much else. There's a little bit of stuff going on around my chin and around my foot. That's probably my fault right there. If we just scoot that over, that's a bit better. Now we can go ahead and we can hit better, and that's going to soften and feather the edges of everything. Now, so that is only a selection for this one frame. So if we want to select myself throughout this entire video clip, what we need to do is we need to hit the tracking functions here. So since I'm already on the first frame of this clip, you can see here, I'm just gonna hit the track forward button. But if you were somewhere in the middle, you could hit this button, which would track forward and backward from this position. So I'm gonna hit the track forward function, and now it's gonna go frame by frame forward and refine the mask around the selection, which is me. Now, sometimes it does a good job, sometimes it's a little bit finicky. I think this one works pretty well because I'm very clearly defined from the background. You can see it's actually doing a really nice job tracking me forward. All of the details of me are getting captured, and we're not getting any of the spillover from the mountains, even when I start walking forward. All right, so we're done tracking. So now what we can do is we can turn off our highlights so we can see the background again. And now we can tweak adjustments for just me. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take the middle point of the curve here and I'm just gonna give a little bit more life. A really, really basic philosophy that I have that you've just witnessed is I wanna correct for the whole image and then I want to isolate the subject. Sometimes the lighting works as such where the subject is already isolated by themselves. You know, the light is shining on them, but sometimes it's working against you, like here, where I'm a little bit darker than I want it to be. Now this is obviously a stylistic choice. You could have me be darker and you can do whatever you want. I'm just showing you the tools and how I do things. So let's break it down here. We used Cinematch to give us just a little bit of extra production value without shooting on an Arri Alexa Mini. Our primaries are where we did most of the heavy lifting here, where we did the bulk of our corrections, and then we did our Magic Mask. So this one looks pretty good. If I wanted to go in and get really fancy, I might tweak the colors on the mountains just a little bit, make it pop out a little bit more, but I don't want to take it too far. I think that subtlety is key. So let's go ahead and copy all of our node tree over to our next clip. Now, the way I like to do that is I'll actually just select the clip in the edit timeline and I'll just hit Command C or just, you know, come up here, copy, and then I will select the target clip. So in some cases that will be the entire timeline, but in this instance, it's just gonna be this one clip, and then we're gonna press Option V. So that's like a special paste where we're only going to be pasting the attributes, and then this window presents itself, and now we choose what we want to copy over. So I want to copy just the color correction and hit apply. And you'll see already we have some problems going on here, but that's okay. So what we're going to do first is we're going to zero out our primaries, reset that, and let's zero out our mask, because we're still going to be using the same transform, we're still going to be using the same Cinematch. So let's go into our primaries first. Now you can see that this is a much different looking image than our last one. Our last one was very soft, it was all midtones. This one's very bright. Now there's a distinction here between cinematic looking footage and video-y looking footage. You know what I mean? Like home movie, iPhone, video-y. And that is that if you look at the scopes on big budget Hollywood films, the whites are almost never actually white. They're actually usually somewhere down here. So if we want to get that kind of cinematic highlight look and keep our footage looking natural, this is what I like to do. So in our primaries, the first thing that we're gonna do is we're just gonna bring our whites down. They're very hot, they're very bright. So let's just bring that down lower than we think we want it. Let's just say right about, let's go even further. Fuck it. 640. We're way down there, right? This is super, super soft. You can see that we still have all of our highlight detail and everything, so that's good. So then, true to tradition, we're just going to take our white point and we're gonna move that up. And again, I'm just looking for a nice contrast between the two. That looks pretty nice. And then we'll go to our blacks. And contrary to the way that we treated the highlights and the whites, bringing them way down, for this shot, I want to go with something a little bit more contrasty. And so we're going to bring the shadows down pretty far. You can see that's a little bit too far. We're losing quite a bit there. But so let's go like right about there. And so that's looking pretty dramatically different than where we were before. That looks like a horrible iPhone video. That looks like it's got some character, but we have more to do. So the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna flick our black point up just a little bit, soften those blacks ever so slightly, play with the shadow point I have here once again. Where you can see we have this distribution here, right? So we have our shadows, this is the dark part of the frame, and then we have all the light stuff. So right here, we're grabbing the darkest of the darks. If we were to grab here, we'll be grabbing the lightest of the darks. So let's go ahead and grab this point, because I want to bring just a little bit more pop back into that. So you see we move it up and some definition until the box comes back. That also lightened our shadows just a little bit. Bring that down just a tiny. And then same thing here. So this point is our highest highlights, more or less. And then if we were to grab over here, that would be the darker side of our highlights. So let's grab that and just move it around a little bit. You can see if I bring it up, that's not too great. So let's bring it down a little bit. We're going for a really kind of high key look here. Okay, so I'm liking how that looks. I'm feeling that the colors aren't exactly where I want them to be. I think that this would really come alive if it were a little bit warmer. So we're gonna go over to the color wheels and we're gonna take our temperature and we're just gonna move it up just a little bit. All right. Now that looks pleasing, but it's almost too golden, right? So we've made everything warmer and overall, it's more pleasing because it's warm, but the wood is now almost too saturated with orange. And so it's kind of a give and a take. You're like, I want to take the image this way, but if I do that, then it's going to introduce this, which I have to correct for, if that makes sense. So what we're gonna do to mitigate that is we're gonna go over to our color warper and we're just gonna take our reds and our yellows and we're just gonna pull them back just a little bit. So if you're not familiar with this tool, this represents the 360 degrees of color on a color wheel, and then the further the point is away from the center, the more saturated it is. So if I were to pull this out, you'll see that the image gets more saturated in the yellows, but if we pull it in, though we're retaining that warmth, but we're actually just sucking a little bit of the color out of it. So the hue is where we want it to be, and now we're dialing the saturation in as well, without affecting the saturation of the entire image. Because if instead we had just said, oh, well, it looks a little bit too saturated now, and we just went in here and we pulled the saturation down, well, now we're pulling the saturation of everything down. We're pulling the saturation of our box down. And so it's not that everything is too saturated, it's that the warm stuff is too saturated. So we go to the color warper, we pull our yellows down just a little bit, and then we'll pull our reds down just a tiny bit as well. Maybe not too much. You kind of want to do it to taste here. And then actually I'm gonna move the yellows just a little bit over towards orange a little bit, because I saw that there was just a tiny bit of green in there. And I don't want the green, I want it to really be nice and warm. Now what I wanna do is I just want to give our subject the film box just a little bit of pop. And so because this subject is moving, we are also going to go to the magic mask. But if it wasn't moving, then we would just come into our power windows and we would draw a selection around it. But since I'm actually going to pick up the box and start moving it around, we're gonna mess with the magic mask. So let's go back to our starting point. Let's make sure we're selecting the proper area, the proper node, magic mask tab, take our dropper and just draw over our box. Okay, toggle on the highlights and we can see that's our selection. It looks okay. Let's hit better. And that's looking, I'm not sure I like that one. I mean, I guess it's okay. It's selecting the purple and that's really what we want to control for. So let's hit better. And then once again, we're going to track that forward. And you can see, even though my hands are all over the box, it's still controlling for just the box. And it's actually doing a pretty good job. Sometimes the magic mask gives me a pretty hard time, but it's doing pretty good. And you see now there we lost it, right? And so let's hit stop. And so we've got the box, but what happens after the box? Well, if we keep going, then we'll see that the box yields way to the little cylinder that holds the film. And we also want to adjust for that as well. So what we can do here is we can go add node, add parallel node, or option P, I believe. And so now this top, the original magic mask one, is for our film box. Now this one can be for our cylinder. All right, so now we will go back into the magic mask and we will draw on our cylinder. And it looks like it's doing a pretty good job. So we will track that forward. And then we'll track it backward to the point where it gets pulled out of the box, and we'll stop it right there. Okay, so now let's go back to where we just have the box. Oop. All right, so now we're gonna go back over to our curves, and we're just gonna brighten up the box just a tiny. Just a little bit of, tiny bit, right? Subtlety is key. And now we're gonna go over to the cylinder. So scrub forward until we're holding the little cylinder and it's where we want it to be. Let's say right there. And same thing, just a little bit extra exposure just to further separate it from the very bright background. All right, let's do something low light, something that isn't so simple. All right, so again, we're just starting with the Cinematch, which is really just tweaking the color of blue a little bit. And then we have our transform, which is doing most of the heavy lifting here. And we're just gonna go into our primaries. Now, actually what I wanna do is I wanna take a closer look. It's kind of hard to see in this bright light and on my laptop screen, but if we zoom in there, it looks like there's a little bit of noise going on here. Actually doesn't look too bad, but I'm gonna run through some noise processing just to show you guys how I would get rid of this. So there are two ways to go through noise reduction. One is more intense than the other one. The first way is actually just within Resolve, and we're gonna go over to motion effects. And I like to adjust the temporal noise reduction frames to 3, and then the Luma threshold to around 7-ish. And then the chroma, I'll actually bring up just a tiny bit. And if we zoom in here, see, so it's cleaning up a lot of that noise, but we're still retaining our sharpness. So that's good. That works pretty well. But in instances where something is even noisier than that, actually, let me just show you an example. Let me go to something really noisy. So when I first got to Badwater, it was very dark, like super dark. It was only because this camera has such great low light that I was actually able to capture anything. And it was actually quite noisy when I first got there. So this is one of the shots that I captured of the water well before the sun rose. And if we zoom in here, you can see that there's quite a bit of noise, right? Like lots of texture that we don't really want. And I'm not a fan of digital noise, I'm a fan of film noise, film grain, but I didn't want this. And so this is an instance where even the noise reduction within Resolve was not quite enough sauce. So there's another plugin that I use here called Neat Video. If we drag that on top, it's gonna ask us to prepare a noise profile. So you hit that button, it brings up its own window. And to be quite honest, I don't really know how to use this that well, but I do know enough. And so basically what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to select a noisy area and press build profile. And it's gonna build a profile based on the noise. And then we hit apply. And now if we zoom in, you'll see that almost all of that noise has been wiped away. Anytime I'm shooting something very high ISO, very low light, I like having this in my back pocket just to know that I can clean it up and make it look better. Sometimes it's a little bit heavy-handed and you need to dial it back, but it is invaluable for run and gun scenarios where the lighting conditions are out of your control and way too low. Now, the only thing about that is that this plugin requires a lot of juice. And so before, you're not gonna be able to, I just press play and it's going frame by frame. So you're gonna need to render that out. And so I'll typically do my corrections and then I will go and I will apply Neat Video underneath it all and then I'll render it out. But real quick, let's just go take a look at what we have going on here. So we have our noise reduction on this layer. We have Cinematch. We have our primaries, which are really just doing, let's see. We just have a very, very modest S-curve up here. Our transform, which is standard. Our creative, what do we have going on here? Okay. So here, I actually have, I don't know why I did this. I have the Cody Rec 709 LUT, and then over here I have no LUT. I have the color space transform. Yes, there we go. Yeah, airy wide gamut to Rec 709. So that might seem like a lot of steps to go through to some of you, but relative to a lot of the color workflows I've seen, I feel like this is actually fairly simple. And this is about as crazy as I get. This project was about the visual appeal, so I was happy to spend more time per shot on this. But what about something that doesn't require multiple layers of finesse, like a regular talking head shot? So this is what I would do in that instance. All right, so this is the talking head shot from my Fuji X-T5 video that I did 2 ago. And I didn't get super fancy with this one at all. You'll see we have a very simple node tree here. Pretty much the same suspects. We have the noise reduction, the primaries, the transform, the secondaries, and the mask. We don't have a creative. We don't have Cinematch or anything like that. And half of these aren't even being used, right? So these ones aren't even being used. So the only thing that I actually used here was a primary correction and then a transform. Now for the transform, we're using, you might have guessed, the Kodacolor S-Log3 to Rec 709 conversion, which is doing most of our work here. But then on the primaries, what do we have? Not much. We really just kind of tweak the curves ever so slightly, and that's it. So I'm a big proponent of getting it right in camera and then just doing the minimal amount necessary in post to get it where you want it to be. Sometimes there's room for a little bit more creative license than other times, but sometimes the magic is in knowing when to stop, because it's the nuance and the subtlety that I think makes something beautiful, not the heavy-handed colors and the editing and the crazy stuff. So if you want to check out the LUTs, they're linked down below. But as we saw here, a LUT is not a complete solution. It is just a tool. It is but part of the workflow. These ones, however, are tools that I use in literally every single video. I rely upon them to get me a good, consistent kind of cinematic base from which I can start doing individual corrections, as you know by now. But you can also always make your own LUT. You don't need to buy Neat Video if your footage isn't super noisy, and Cinematch is just a nice to have. I didn't make this video to say that you need to buy something in order to make your footage look better. I just made it to show you the complete start to finish color grading workflow that I use and all the tools within it. But really the important part here is making sure that you get it right in camera and pre-visualizing where you want to take the footage as you're shooting it, and then kind of just massaging it in that direction once you get on the timeline. And these principles can apply to any work that you want to create. I just happen to kind of stop where I feel like it's natural with character. So I might not have the most crazy looking stuff, but that's all right with me. Natural-ish is the look that is probably going to stay here on the channel. So yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. And yeah, till next time. Peace.